I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. What I share is not political, and it is not propaganda. This is my true story about faith and responsibility in a country that has endured far too much violence. Burkina Faso has never been stable. Instability does not come only from outside. It grows from within division, hidden interests, and coups that have never truly ended. When people live in such conditions for too long, fear becomes familiar. I grew up in the military. For us, a coup is not a surprise. It is always present in silence. Danger rarely announces itself. It arrives when everything begins to fall out of rhythm. Before that night, I had no evidence, no official warning, but I knew something was wrong. I understood that if a coup happened, people would die, and I could be one of them. I was afraid. I did not feel strong or prepared, but I did not run. That night, I did something I had never done before. I stopped trying to control everything. I turned to God, repeating a simple prayer again and again. Lord, please save me. If it is possible, please let me pass through this in peace. I share this with Muslims, Christians, leaders of the Sahel, and people of faith around the world. Power does not protect the soul. If death were to approach quietly, without warning, would you trust your power, or would you surrender? The night arrived without ceremony. There was no announcement, no siren, no dramatic warning. It was simply a night that felt heavier than the ones before it. The air itself seemed tense, as if the darkness was holding its breath. I was still an officer then, trained to remain alert, trained not to trust comfort. And yet nothing in my training prepared me for the weight I felt in my chest that evening. I remember sitting alone, listening more than thinking. Soldiers learn early that danger often comes wrapped in quiet. Phones stop ringing, footsteps sound different. People avoid eye contact without knowing why. That night, everything felt slightly out of place, as if the rhythm of the camp had shifted by a fraction only those inside it could sense. I had no written order in my hands, no intelligence report confirmed my fear. If someone had asked me for evidence, I would have had none to give. But fear does not always wait for permission. It arrives when the mind begins to connect small signs that logic alone cannot yet explain. I knew what a coup meant in Burkina Faso. History had taught us that coups do not unfold like clean pages in a book. They unfold in shadows, in hurried decisions, in gunfire that echoes too close to home. I understood, with a clarity that chilled me, that if such a night came, it would demand blood. And I understood something even harder. I could be one of the names written silently on a list. Assassination is not discussed openly, but everyone knows it is part of the unspoken script. When power shifts violently, some lives are erased to make the transition possible. I felt fear, and I will not pretend otherwise. I am not proud of that fear, but I am not ashamed of it either. Fear is honest. Fear strips away illusion. In that moment, I did not feel like a future president. I did not feel like a symbol. I felt like a man facing the possibility that his life could end before morning. There were practical options available to me. I could have moved. I could have called allies. I could have attempted to hide or flee. All those thoughts passed through my mind briefly and then left. Not because they were wrong, but because they felt insufficient. They relied entirely on my own strength, my own calculation, my own ability to outmaneuver forces I could not see. For the first time in my life, I recognized the limit of strategy. So I stopped. I knelt. This is difficult to explain to those who believe prayer is a performance or a ritual. What I did that night was neither. I did not recite polished words. I did not bargain. I did not make promises. I simply placed my life, fully and without defense, into God's hands. I spoke as a man who believed he might not see another sunrise. Lord, I said, please save me. If you will, carry me through this night. There was no poetry in it, no religious display, only truth, only surrender. I want to be clear for those listening from different faith traditions. When I speak of God, I speak of the one who judges the heart, not appearances. And when I speak of Jesus Christ, I speak of the one who taught us to surrender fear, to trust beyond power, and to place our lives into God's will, even unto death. That night, his example mattered to me more than doctrine. Nothing dramatic followed. No voice thundered from the sky. No light broke through the darkness. The world did not change around me, but something changed within me. The fear loosened its grip, not gradually but decisively. My breathing slowed. My thoughts became still. The images of violence that had filled my mind lost their force. In their place came an unfamiliar calm, deep and steady, as if my soul had found solid ground beneath chaos. I was still aware of danger. I was not naive, but I was no longer panicked. I had released the outcome. Whatever happened next, I was no longer alone in it. That peace did not come from courage, it did not come from denial, it came from trust. A trust that said, even if this night ends my life, it will not end my meaning. I remained there for a long time, not asking for more, not demanding answers, simply resting. And for the first time since the fear had begun, I slept. When I woke, the night was still intact. The silence remained. But I carried that peace with me through every hour until dawn. At the time, I did not understand what had truly happened. I only knew that something unseen had intervened, not by removing danger immediately, but by removing fear from my heart. If you are listening and have ever faced a moment when control slipped from your hands, you may understand what I am describing. This was not escape. This was surrender. In the next part, I will tell you what did not happen that night, and why that absence itself changed my life forever. Morning came quietly. There was no explosion of news, no urgent knock on my door, no sudden rush of armed men through the corridors. Dawn arrived the way it always does in Burkina Faso, softly and without apology. Birds moved before people did. Light touched the walls before it touched my thoughts. The coup I had feared did not happen. The assassination I believed might come for me did not occur. I was still alive. At first, I did not allow myself to feel relief. Years in uniform teach you not to trust the first calm after tension. Sometimes danger delays itself. Sometimes plans change shape instead of disappearing. I remained alert, attentive, cautious. But as the hours passed, nothing unfolded. No shots were fired, no units mobilized, no radio channels crackled with coded urgency. The city breathed normally, soldiers followed routine. Even the subtle signs I had sensed before were gone, as if the night itself had exhaled and moved on. I remember standing alone later that morning, feeling something I had not expected. It was not triumph, it was not pride, it was confusion mixed with gratitude. The kind of gratitude that does not yet understand what it is thanking God for, only that thanks are owed. I asked myself whether I had imagined the danger, whether fear had exaggerated fragments into a story that never truly existed. This is how the mind protects itself. It tries to rewrite history quickly, to make the night feel less real than it was. But my body remembered. My heart remembered the weight of that prayer. My soul remembered the peace that arrived without explanation. Those things do not come from imagination alone. They come from confrontation with something real. Still, I said nothing to anyone. I did not testify. I did not announce what I had felt or feared. Leaders learn early that speaking too soon can create panic, or worse, create enemies who were not yet ready to reveal themselves. So I waited. Time passed slowly, as it does after nights that almost break us. One day became two. Conversations resumed their usual tone. Meetings returned to their formal rhythm. Outwardly, life moved forward as if nothing had nearly happened. Inwardly, I was changed. There is a particular humility that comes from surviving something that never fully reveals itself. When danger announces itself clearly, survival feels like victory. But when danger vanishes silently, survival feels like mercy, and mercy leaves you quiet. I began to reflect deeply on what that night had shown me. Not about politics, not about strategy, but about myself. I realized how quickly strength dissolves when life itself is threatened. How little titles matter when the question becomes whether you will see another sunrise. I also realized something uncomfortable. I had spent much of my life preparing to act, to command, to decide. Yet in the most critical moment, the most honest act I could perform was surrender. That realization unsettled me. For those listening from the United States or the United Kingdom, many of you have lived through wars, terrorist attacks, and political violence from a distance or up close. You know the feeling of waking up after a feared event did not occur, that strange mixture of disbelief and silence. You also know how easily such moments are dismissed. We tell ourselves we were lucky. We tell ourselves it was coincidence. We tell ourselves not to read meaning into absence. But absence can speak as loudly as action if we allow ourselves to listen. That morning, I did not yet call it divine intervention. I did not yet speak the name of Jesus in relation to what had happened. I only knew that something I had feared with my whole being had been held back, restrained, undone, and that restraint did not come from me. As the second day passed, something else began to trouble me. If my fear had been wrong, why had it been so precise? Why had the peace arrived at the exact moment of prayer? Why did my instincts, trained over years of service, still insist that the threat had been real? These questions would not leave me. They followed me through routine tasks and quiet moments alike. It was as if the night had ended, but the story had not yet revealed its second half. I did not know then that answers were already moving toward me. I did not know that someone else, carrying the weight of failure and guilt, was preparing to speak. I did not know that the silence itself was only temporary. What I knew was this: I had been spared, and I did not yet understand why. In the next part, I will tell you what happened 1 to 2 days later, when truth surfaced in a way I could not have anticipated, and when the night finally explained itself. 2 days after that night, the silence broke. It did not break loudly. It broke the way truth often does, through a human voice carrying exhaustion. I was informed that one of the figures connected to irregular movements within the ranks wished to speak, not to negotiate, not to threaten, to confess. I remember the moment clearly. My first reaction was caution, not relief. Confessions in unstable times are rarely pure. They can be traps. They can be partial truths designed to protect something deeper. Still, responsibility demanded that I listen. When the man stood before me, he did not look victorious. He did not look defiant. He looked like someone who had carried a weight that suddenly became unbearable. His posture was not that of a strategist. It was the posture of someone whose plan had collapsed from the inside. He began slowly, choosing words as if they could still hurt him. He spoke of meetings that had taken place quietly, of alliances formed through whispers, of a timeline set with care. He described movements that were supposed to align, orders that were supposed to be obeyed, and a night that had been chosen with precision. As he spoke, my body grew still. Because he was describing the very night I had feared. He spoke of the exact window of time. He spoke of forces positioned and ready. He spoke of how the operation was meant to begin, and how, once it did, certain individuals were not expected to survive the transition. He did not need to say my name. The implication was clear. Then his voice changed. He paused, not for effect, but because language seemed to fail him, and when he continued, his tone was no longer strategic, it was confused. At the decisive moment, he said, everything collapsed. He explained that orders were not followed, that communications failed without clear cause, that individuals who had been committed only hours earlier suddenly hesitated or withdrew. He spoke of fear spreading without an identifiable source, of confidence dissolving into uncertainty. The assassination failed, he said quietly. The coup dissolved. No one understands why. I listened without interruption. I did not ask questions. I did not press him for details he could not give. Because as he spoke, another voice echoed inside me, not audible, but unmistakable. The voice of that prayer. The night returned to me in full clarity. The kneeling, the surrender, the peace that arrived without explanation. And now, before me stood a man describing failure without a reason, collapse without an enemy, impossibility without logic. There was no tactical explanation that satisfied what I was hearing. No military doctrine that accounted for coordinated resolve unraveling at the precise moment it should have hardened. I had seen plans fail before, but they fail messily, unevenly. This had failed completely. I felt no desire to celebrate. I felt no urge to claim victory. What I felt was awe mixed with fear. Not fear of men, but fear of the reality that something beyond human control had intervened. For those listening who come from Christian faith, you may understand what I realized then. This was not coincidence layered upon coincidence. This was intervention. Quiet, undramatic, but decisive. I did not say this aloud in that moment. I did not preach to the man standing before me. Confession is sacred, even when it arrives in political form. I let him finish. I acknowledged what he had shared, and I dismissed him with gravity. When I was alone again, I did something unexpected. I thanked Jesus Christ, not because I had been strong, not because I had been righteous, but because I had been heard, because when I had nothing left but surrender, it had been enough. I know that among my listeners are Muslims who believe deeply in the mercy and sovereignty of God. I know there are Christians who recognize the hand of Christ in moments like these, and I know there are leaders who believe only in power and chance. I am not here to argue theology. I am here to testify to experience. What happened cannot be explained fully by strategy. It cannot be reduced to luck. It cannot be dismissed as imagination. A plan existed. A threat was real. And yet, at the moment when violence should have erupted, it simply could not proceed. Jesus taught that those who lose their lives for truth will find them. That night, I lost my grip on my own life, and in doing so, I found it preserved. This realization did not make me feel superior. It made me feel accountable. If my life had been spared, it was not for comfort. It was for responsibility. It was not to dominate. It was to serve with humility. In the days that followed, I reflected deeply on what leadership means in a land like ours. Not dominance, not survival at all costs, but moral clarity under pressure and surrender before God when human strength fails. This confession marked a turning point, not only in events, but in my understanding of why I was still alive. In the next part, I will share the recognition that settled in my heart as I connected that night, that confession, and the peace that came between them. As I sat alone after that confession, the story finally aligned. Until then, each part had existed separately in my mind. The fear before the night, the prayer spoken without elegance, the peace that arrived without explanation, the quiet morning, the unexpected confession. I had treated them as fragments, connected by emotion but not yet by meaning. Now they formed a single line. I understood that the night was not empty. It had been filled with a decision I had never made before. For the first time, I had stopped negotiating with fate, stopped calculating outcomes, stopped relying on training and instinct alone. I had placed my life, completely and without reserve, into God's hands. Not as a politician, not as a soldier, but as a man who knew he could not save himself. That realization humbled me deeply. I did not survive because I was necessary. I did not survive because I was clever. I did not survive because I deserved it more than others who had died before me. That truth was uncomfortable because it removed pride from the story entirely. What remained was grace. For those who follow Jesus Christ, you understand that grace is never earned. It is received. That night, I did not offer God my plans or my promises. I offered him my fear, and when I did, fear lost its power over me. I recognized then that the peace I felt was not emotional relief, it was consent. It was the moment my will stopped resisting God's will. And in that surrender, something else had been allowed to move. I cannot explain how God intervenes in history. I cannot describe the mechanics of divine restraint, but I can say this with certainty. When I released control, control was taken from those who intended harm. The men involved did not suddenly become righteous, the world did not become safe overnight, but the specific violence aimed at that night could not complete itself. Something blocked it, not visibly, not dramatically, but completely. I realized that Jesus Christ had not intervened because I was important. He intervened because prayer invites God into history, not to erase all suffering, but to prevent meaning from being destroyed by it. This recognition did not make me feel chosen. It made me feel watched. Watched in the way that demands integrity, watched in the way that removes excuses. If my life had been preserved, then how I lived it from that point forward mattered deeply. I also understood something that many leaders avoid admitting. Power does not protect you from death, it only delays your confrontation with it. Faith, however, prepares you for that confrontation, whether death comes or passes you by. That night taught me that leadership without surrender becomes tyranny, and strength without humility becomes violence. It taught me that the most decisive act I took was not issuing an order, but kneeling. For my Muslim brothers and sisters, I say this with respect. When a servant places himself fully under the will of God, God responds in ways beyond human planning. For my Christian brothers and sisters, I say this plainly. Jesus Christ is not confined to private spirituality. He enters history when invited with sincerity. And for leaders across the Sahel and across the world, I say this quietly. If you believe your survival depends only on control, you are already afraid. True courage begins where surrender begins. This realization changed how I saw my life, my leadership, and my responsibility to my people. And it prepared me for the lessons that followed. What followed was not certainty, but responsibility. When you survive a moment that should have ended you, you are forced to ask why your life continued when others did not. That question does not flatter you, it disciplines you. It demands that you live differently, speak carefully, and lead with restraint. From that night, several lessons settled in me slowly. They did not arrive as rules carved in stone. They arrived as convictions shaped by fear, mercy, and time. The first lesson was this. A leader who does not place God above himself will eventually place himself above others. Power creates the illusion of protection, but it is a fragile illusion. Titles do not shield the body. Influence does not calm the soul. Only humility before God does that. When a leader forgets this, he begins to believe he is untouchable, and that belief always precedes collapse. The second lesson was harder to accept. Prayer is not an escape from responsibility. It is the foundation of right action. Many believe that to pray is to withdraw from reality. That night taught me the opposite. Prayer clarified reality. It stripped away panic and sharpened discernment. A man who prays sincerely does not become passive. He becomes more precise, more restrained, more aware of consequences. I learned that inner peace is not weakness, it is a signal. When fear disappeared from my heart that night, it was not because danger vanished, it was because my soul had stopped resisting truth. Peace, real peace, is often the sign that God is taking control of what you can no longer manage. Another lesson followed naturally. Not every battle is meant to be won with weapons. Some conflicts escalate precisely because leaders refuse to kneel. Violence often grows where humility could have stopped it. That night, no gun was fired, no command was shouted, and yet a catastrophe was prevented. This does not make prayer a substitute for defense. It makes it the boundary that keeps defense from becoming destruction. I also understood something that challenges modern thinking. Jesus Christ does not act only in private lives. He can intervene in history itself. He does not always do so visibly. He does not always prevent suffering, but there are moments when entire chains of violence are stopped quietly, without explanation, because one human being chose surrender over control. That realization frightened me more than the fear of assassination ever did, because it meant my life was no longer my own. If it had been spared, it was not for personal comfort or ambition. It was to testify, through restraint and conscience, that God is still present in a world obsessed with force. The final lesson was the most sobering. Survival is not a reward, it is a calling. To be alive after such a night is not permission to boast. It is an obligation to witness. My life was given back to me so that I could remind others that violence is not inevitable and that God has not abandoned places the world has written off as hopeless. From that point on, every decision carried more weight. Not because I feared death, but because I feared betraying the mercy that had spared me. Leadership became less about asserting will and more about guarding conscience. I prayed differently after that night, not only for myself but for Burkina Faso, a land wounded by poverty and prolonged conflict. I ask Jesus Christ to grant us wisdom that does not inflame division, and courage that does not depend on cruelty. I prayed for Africa, a continent rich in faith but too familiar with bloodshed, that its leaders would choose humility over domination. And I prayed for myself that I would never forget the sound of my own voice asking God for mercy, stripped of rank and certainty. If you are listening to this story and it resonates with something you have lived through, I invite you to reflect, not react. Share your thoughts in the comments if you feel led. And if you wish to continue walking through these reflections with me, consider subscribing, not for information, but for reflection. In the next and final part, I will speak directly to the world, to Africa, and to leaders everywhere, and I will end with the choice that faces me every single morning. I want to end by speaking plainly, not as a strategist, not as a symbol, but as a man who has been spared and therefore must speak. To the world watching Africa from a distance, often only when violence erupts, I ask you to remember that behind every headline there are human beings who pray, who fear, who hope, and who try to choose rightly under impossible pressure. Africa is not only a place of conflict, it is a place of conscience, and conscience, when guided by God, can still interrupt history. To my brothers and sisters across Africa, especially in the Sahel, I speak with humility. We govern lands where poverty is deep and patience is thin. We inherit wounds we did not create. But we must not use history as an excuse to abandon morality. Power gained without reverence for God will always demand blood to sustain itself. Power guided by humility can still protect life, even in fragile nations. To leaders everywhere, whether elected or imposed, whether admired or feared, I say this quietly. The most dangerous moment in leadership is when you believe you no longer need to kneel. When advisors replace conscience, when strategy replaces prayer, when survival replaces meaning, you may still rule, but you are already lost. To the Christian community, especially those who love Jesus Christ and wonder whether faith still matters in a violent world, I testify that it does. Christ is not absent from history. He is present, often unseen, restraining what could have destroyed far more than one life. He does not promise comfort, he promises truth. And sometimes, truth arrives as peace in the middle of fear. To the Muslim community, whom I respect deeply, I say this from the heart. When a servant places his life fully in the hands of God, with sincerity and fear of the Almighty, God responds in ways beyond human design. This truth unites us more than politics ever could. Submission to God is not weakness, it is clarity. To the people of Burkina Faso, my people, I carry this story not as a shield, but as a reminder. Our future cannot be built on revenge, nor sustained by force alone. We must choose restraint when provoked, justice when anger feels easier, and faith when despair seems reasonable. I pray that Jesus Christ grants our nation wisdom that heals rather than divides, and courage that does not depend on violence. I also speak to those over 50, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, who have seen cycles repeat and promises break. You know that history does not end with one election, one war, or one leader. It turns on daily choices. You understand that faith, when it survives decades of disappointment, becomes deeper, quieter, and more demanding. This message is for you too. I am not asking you to admire me. I am asking you to reflect. To ask yourself where you have relied too heavily on control and where you might need to surrender. To ask whether your strength has made you peaceful or simply powerful. If this story has stirred something in you, do not rush past it. Sit with it, speak about it, leave a comment if you wish, not to argue but to share reflection. And if you want to continue exploring the meaning of faith, leadership, and conscience in troubled times, you are welcome to stay, to listen, and to subscribe. I will end where I began, with a choice. Each morning I wake up knowing that survival was not guaranteed to me, and meaning is not guaranteed to anyone. Every day, I must choose again. To listen rather than dominate, to kneel rather than harden, to lead as a servant rather than a master. There is no final victory. There is only vigilance. Each day I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory, only awareness or surrender.